son and his wife always thought I was just the quiet one, the woman who folded their laundry, set the table, and vanished from the room without a sound. They never once asked who I was before I became someone's mother, someone's wife, someone else's shadow. To them, I was convenient, invisible, almost forgettable, especially to my sister-in-law, who loved it when I melted into the background of her perfect photos, blending in like wallpaper from another era. But the day she laughed at me in front of her friends, calling me uneducated as if it were a harmless joke, I didn't argue. I didn't flinch. I simply smiled and walked away. But here's what nobody in that room knew. That moment woke up something ancient inside me, something powerful, something they never saw coming. That night, I went to my room and opened a box I hadn't touched in years. Inside was a secret, a truth I'd kept hidden, a truth that would change everything they thought they knew about me. Because sometimes the loudest thing a woman can do is quietly remind the world of who she was before she let it squeeze her into silence. If you think you know where this story is going, stay with me. By the end of this video, you'll realize just how wrong they were. And maybe, just maybe, you'll discover something extraordinary about yourself too. Let me tell you the whole story. But first, take a moment and hit subscribe button. It will help me a lot, and also let me know in the comments where you're listening. From your city or country. I genuinely want to know where my stories reach. So I'd lived in that house for nearly 5 years. It was meant to be temporary. Just a short stay after selling my old home. Until I figured out my next steps. But life has a way of settling into corners, of repeating patterns you never meant to repeat. My son insisted at first. It made no sense for me to live alone when they had space. Back then it felt like a generous offer, like family. In the beginning I helped with everything. I cooked breakfast before anyone woke up, folded laundry quietly, and left neat piles outside their bedroom. I picked up groceries. I made myself invisible in the way only older women seem to master. Present, useful, but never loud enough to disturb the rhythm of younger lives. But as months turned to years, that invisibility stopped being a choice. It became expected. I'd sit at the kitchen table in the mornings, reading an old paperback while they scrolled through their phones, and shared plans I was never part of. There was a time my son asked for advice. Now, he barely looked up from his screen, and my daughter-in-law treated me like part of the furniture polite distant, with the kind of forced smile you give a stranger you don't quite trust. She called me Mom only when guests were around. Otherwise, I was just her. Not cruel, just cold, as if my presence was an inconvenience. I tried not to take it personally. After all, it was their home too. They had careers to build, dinners to host, friendships to nurture. I was just a placeholder from another time, a relic who didn't speak the language of their ambition or their jokes, who didn't measure self-worth by LinkedIn titles or brunch reservations. I tried not to mind. I made sure dinner was always ready when they came home. Pot roast, lasagna, slow-cooked stews that filled the house with warmth. Sometimes I'd hear her sigh before she even reached the kitchen, complaining about heavy food and cutting carbs. I'd offer to make something else. She'd say it was fine, but her face always said otherwise. She rearranged the fridge after I organized it. She replaced my dish soap with eco-friendly brands that made my hands crack. She started labeling the spice jars, not because I forgot them, but because she didn't like how I placed them. Small things, really, but they added up like paper cuts, silent dismissals that reminded me of my place. Even my space in the house felt conditional. My bedroom, once the guest room, became my only refuge. I spent more time there, reading, knitting, watching old court dramas on my tablet with headphones so I wouldn't disturb the flow of the open-plan living room. My books on one shelf, my sweaters in one drawer. Everything else belonged to them. I didn't mind not being seen. I'd known that feeling before, as a young woman in a male-dominated law firm where my ideas mattered only when a man repeated them. As a mother whose sacrifices were understood but never spoken of. Being unseen was nothing new. But in your own son's house, the feeling stings in a way you can't ignore. My daughter-in-law started hosting more often brunches, wine nights, book clubs. I helped prepare quietly, then retreated to my room. Sometimes they didn't even knock. They used the good plates and the tablecloths I'd brought from my old home. Once I overheard her telling a guest she'd found them at a vintage shop in Brooklyn. I said nothing. What was the point? I stayed out of photos, out of conversations, out of their way. Still, I tried to show gratitude. I bought flowers for the table, sewed new kitchen curtains, clipped coupons, baked muffins for her co-workers. I kept telling myself I was lucky to be around family. That distance was just the way of modern life, not malice. But deep down, the ache of displacement grew, a slow erosion of identity until I felt like a shadow in the corner of someone else's life. They never asked what I'd done before retirement, never wondered why I chose my words so carefully, why I watched so much. I wasn't a mystery to them, just a non-story, a footnote. Sometimes I'd catch my reflection and not recognize the woman looking back. I looked older in their mirrors like someone who had overstayed her welcome. I kept telling myself to be grateful, that it was just temporary, that I still had a place here, until one day I stopped believing it. The day of the party arrived, quietly, though I'd known about it for over a week. She mentioned it offhandedly in a morning call, saying it was just a casual girls' thing. Nothing big, but nothing in this house was ever truly casual. Not her clothes, not the food, not the way she spoke. Everything was curated, polished, intentional. I offered to help, as always. She barely looked at me when she thanked me, but she didn't refuse. So I ironed the tablecloth, cleaned the silverware, polished the glasses, and arranged the appetizers. I stayed in the background, my hands working from memory. It wasn't the first time I'd prepared for guests I wouldn't speak to, and probably wouldn't be the last. She didn't ask me to leave. She didn't have to. I knew my role: help set up, then disappear. That's what I'd been doing for years. The only difference now was how natural it all felt. By late afternoon, the house was filled with the aroma of roasted vegetables, spiced nuts, and balsamic glazes. Every candle was lit, every plate perfectly placed. Trendy music played low as her friends arrived, women in their early 30s, manicured, confident, full of laughter. They greeted her with hugs and compliments. She basked in it. The house looked stunning, they said, so stylish, so elegant. I heard them from the kitchen arranging the last of the fruit. I'd planned to go to my room, but I lingered by the edge of the dining room, sipping tea, half hidden behind the pantry doorframe. Maybe I wanted to hear what they'd say. Maybe I just wanted to feel included for a moment. They talked about everything: promotions, Pilates, wellness retreats. She was the center of it all, laughing, pouring wine like a hostess from a magazine. They all admired the floral centerpiece I'd made that morning. She took credit, saying she got the idea from Pinterest. One of her friends noticed me, a glance, a nod. Then another smiled and asked a question, something about who I was or where I was from. My daughter-in-law answered for me, loud enough for everyone, but light enough to sound like a joke. That was her style. She called me the sweet, quiet mother-in-law, then added something about how I'd never really been into school, that I was more hands-on than academic. There was a pause, then laughter. Not cruel, but sharp enough to sting. Someone asked if I'd ever gone to college. She laughed again, said she wasn't sure, but probably not. Said I always seemed more like a doer than a thinker. I didn't react. I didn't move. I stood there holding my tea, feeling the warmth of the porcelain in my palm. I stared into the mug, wishing I could disappear inside it. There was no malice in her words that made it worse. She wasn't trying to hurt me. It was just a reflex, a joke to fill the silence. But it landed like a slap. Not because it was cruel, but because it was so casual. It meant nothing to her, but everything to me. I'd worked so hard, studied late at night while working full-time, passed the bar while raising a toddler, argued cases in courtrooms where men wanted me to fail. I had done all of that, and now I was reduced to a punchline in my own home. No one asked me to speak for myself. No one turned to me for clarification. They just kept sipping wine, leaning into the comfort of their curated moment, content with the version of me she offered. I slipped away to the kitchen, careful not to let the door creak. I didn't want them to hear me leave or remember I was there. Back in my room, I sat on my bed, mug still full. I didn't cry. I'd done enough of that in my life. Instead, I sat in silence, letting the party noise blur into the background. Their voices rose and fell through the walls, like distant waves. It wasn't just the insult. It was the erasure. The fact that she could say something so untrue, so diminishing, and no one would question it, because to them, I was exactly what she described. Invisible, unimpressive, just a sweet old woman who kept things tidy. She didn't know who I had been. None of them did, but I realized I had allowed it. I had let myself fade, little by little, until I became the person they imagined, harmless, simple, uneducated. I looked toward the closet. I hadn't opened the top shelf in years. Somewhere, under old blankets and dusty photo albums, was a box. I remembered its texture, its weight, the papers inside, my name in gold letters. I didn't get up right away, but something inside me had shifted. I sat and listened to them laugh, knowing that the next time she spoke my name, it wouldn't be with pity. It would be with shame. The morning after the party was unusually quiet, not peaceful, but the kind of quiet that lingers after something has changed. I moved through the kitchen as always, making coffee, wiping counters, straightening chairs. My routine was the same, but everything inside me was different. They hadn't said anything after the party. She hadn't thanked me for setting the table or asked if I needed help cleaning up. My son hadn't mentioned anything either. Maybe he hadn't noticed. Maybe to him, it was just another evening. But to me, something had been carved out of the air that night. Something that couldn't be replaced. I kept myself busy, swept the floor twice, reorganized the pantry, folded the same dish towel 3 times, anything to avoid stillness, because stillness meant remembering the way her voice curled around, uneducated, like it was an accessory, remembering the laughter not at me, but around me, as if I was just another empty space in the conversation. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just moved. My room felt smaller that day, as if the walls had crept closer overnight. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the closet door, thinking about the box. It had been so long since I'd opened. It's so long since I'd let myself remember what was inside. Part of me had let go of that identity years ago, filed it away with the suits I no longer wore, the heels I no longer needed, and the woman I used to be. But she wasn't gone, just waiting, buried beneath years of service and silence. I stood up slowly and opened the closet. The top shelf was high, so I pulled over a chair. My knees cracked as I climbed up, my hands trembling as I reached behind folded blankets and unused holiday decorations. And then I found it, the box I'd carried through 4 apartments and 2 decades, the one I almost threw away after my husband died. But something told me not to throw it away. I brought the box down gently, brushed the dust from its lid, and set it on the bed. For a moment, I just looked at it, feeling a sense of reverence. Then I opened it. The scent of old paper rose, up faint ink, dried glue, time. Inside, neatly organized, were fragments of a life few in this house even knew existed. My law degree, letters from firms that once tried to recruit me, newspaper clippings with my name beneath courtroom victories, photos from the day I passed, the bar. My smile was wide and certain, my eyes sharper than they'd ever be again. I held the diploma in my hands, its edges curled, but the lettering still bold proof that I once stood in rooms where my words mattered. I sat with it for a long time, not reading, just feeling the weight of the paper and everything it represented, all the late nights studying after putting my child to bed, all the times I swallowed my fear and spoke up, or all the years I spent proving I was more than what people expected. And now, I was a ghost in a house that thought I had never lived. The silence wasn't just around me. It had become part of me. I had let their comfort replace my story, had become so careful, so small, so agreeable that they forgot I'd ever been anything else. But I hadn't forgotten. Not anymore. I placed the diploma back in the box, gently, like something fragile. Then I added a copy of the deed to the house, the one they didn't know was still in my name. I tucked in a folded spreadsheet, tracking every expense for the last 8 months, groceries, utilities, taxes. I slipped in a printout of a rental agreement template I'd found online the night before. It wasn't revenge. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I just wanted to be seen again, not as a burden or a relic, but as a person with history and value, someone who deserved respect. I closed the box and slid it under my bed, not to hide it, but because I knew I wasn't ready to use it yet. But the moment would come. I could feel it building, slow and certain, like a storm on the horizon. That day I didn't speak much. I made dinner, served it, cleaned up. They didn't notice the difference, but I did. The silence had shifted. It was no longer theirs. It was mine. The day I decided to write the bill, the sky was gray and low, as if the world had exhaled and forgotten to breathe back in. There was no dramatic spark, no final insult, no confrontation, just another quiet day, in a long line of days where I stood still while the world moved around me as if I wasn't there. But inside something had settled. Not anger, not revenge, just resolve. They left early that morning, both dressed sharply, briefcases in hand, voices trailing with laughter about some office joke. She didn't say goodbye. He muttered something on his way out, but it didn't land. I stayed at the kitchen, table after the door shut behind them, my hands resting on the wood, my tea untouched. I listened to the silence. It was deep, thick, almost tender. It gave me room to think, room to finally act. The house was mine. That was the truth. My name was on the deed. I had bought it outright after selling my previous home, no mortgage, no co-signers, no hidden clauses. I had invited them in, offered them a safe place to start their marriage, believing it would be temporary, that they'd eventually find their own place and leave me to rediscover my own life. But temporary became indefinite, and somewhere along the way, I became an afterthought in my own space. I pulled out my files from the small lockbox in the hallway closet. Inside were neatly organized folders, property documents, insurance, medical, records, old tax returns. I took out the deed and laid it on the kitchen table, smoothing the edges with my palm. My name looked strange to me now, printed so boldly, like it belonged to someone I used to know. Then I opened a new file on my laptop, a blank document. The cursor blinked, waiting. I titled it simply, Rental Agreement. I wasn't sure exactly what I was doing, but I knew what I wanted it to feel like. Not petty or spiteful, just fair and professional, the way I had handled contracts before I became someone's mother-in-law and live-in cook. I calculated everything I'd contributed since they moved in, the electricity bills I'd paid, the food I'd stocked, the furniture I'd replaced without ever mentioning the price tags. I didn't inflate the numbers. I wasn't trying to shame them. I only wanted them to see the value I provided, the weight I carried in silence. I divided the months. 8. That's how long it had been since they promised they'd start looking for their own place. I printed each month's name in bold, followed by a breakdown of living costs. At the bottom, I added a single line, due upon receipt. I read over the document twice. It wasn't aggressive. It was clear, factual, respectful, but it told the truth they had chosen not to see. That living in someone's home came with responsibility. That comfort isn't the same as entitlement. That generosity has limits, even from a mother. I placed the printed bill beside the deed. I thought about slipping it into their room, leaving it on the nightstand. But that felt sneaky, and I was done being passive. Instead, I went back to my room, knelt beside the bed, and pulled out the box again. I opened the lid, folded the rental document, and placed it atop the diploma. It felt right, the two papers together. Proof of who I had been, and proof of who I still was. That night, I made dinner as always. I served it quietly. They chatted about work, a new restaurant downtown, an upcoming wedding. She complimented the risotto, but added it could use less salt next time. I nodded and smiled, but I was somewhere else entirely. Later, when the dishes were done and they disappeared into the living room to watch TV, I sat in my room with the lamp on low, staring at the box. I didn't feel fear or vindication, just calm, the kind that comes after weeks of sleepless nights when something inside finally aligns. I wasn't trying to make a statement or start a war. I was simply returning the truth to its place. They had forgotten I had built a life before them. Soon I would remind them quietly, precisely, like a closing argument. The day I decided to return the truth, the sun came out in thin, watery streaks, as if it wasn't sure it wanted to commit. The kitchen smelled of lemons and starch from the cleaner I'd used that morning, scrubbing every surface until it gleamed. Not because it needed it, but because I needed the silence and discipline of doing something simple and final. She had another gathering planned. I knew before she said a word. I'd heard her on the phone giggling, telling someone to bring that incredible Riesling and to come hungry because the old lady always cooks too much. She said it so casually, like I was just a fixture with ears too old to understand. So I cooked. I did it with the same quiet care I always had: roasted vegetables, 3 kinds of salad, a quiche that took hours to perfect. I ironed the napkins, laid out the cutlery, arranged the chairs. I poured her candles into crystal holders, polished the wine glasses, trimmed flowers from the garden, and placed them in a vase on the table. I wasn't doing it for them. I was doing it for me, for the part of me that always took pride in setting a table with intention, in making a space feel whole. The house filled slowly. First came her closest friends, the ones who wore leather boots in summer and smelled like designer perfume. Then the newer ones, the kind who asked questions they didn't want answers to. They moved through the house with laughter like wind through thin curtains light. Restless, meaningless, I stayed in the background, as always, standing by the hallway near the kitchen, pretending to inspect the spice rack. I sipped my tea. I waited. They gathered in the living room, wine glasses in hand, legs tucked beneath them on the sofa. Voices, rising in crescendos of gossip and curated outrage. I could hear her leading the conversation, her voice louder than necessary, her opinions always tailored to impress. Then someone mentioned education, a documentary, a podcast, something about higher learning. Instantly, I felt the air shift. I knew what was coming before she even spoke. She said not everyone needed college, that some people just weren't cut out for it. Laughing softly, dismissively, as if education was just another passing trend. Then, as if on cue, someone joked about me, had I ever gone to school. She repeated her line almost word for word. She's more of a homebody, not really academic, but she's great with laundry and soup. Laughter followed. I tasted the air between it, and then I moved. I walked into the living room, holding the box in my arms. At first, no one noticed. I placed the box on the coffee table, right between their expensive wine and curated charcuterie. Only then did she look up. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. I opened the box, first the diploma still sharp and clean in its sleeve. I lifted it, presenting it like evidence, and set it in front of her. Then turned it for the others to see. I let them read the seal, the signature, the institution that many of them had only dreamed of attending. Then I pulled out the rent summary, each line printed neatly. I placed it beside the diploma, letting her understand. I didn't smile or explain. I simply nodded and walked away. Back in my room, I closed the door with care and sat on the edge of the bed, waiting. Not for a response, but for the silence that would follow. The kind of silence that weighs more than words. I didn't hear their voices after that. Maybe they left early. Maybe they stayed in stunned confusion. I didn't check. I had said everything I needed to say without uttering a word. For the first time in years, I felt heard, not because they finally saw who I was, but because I stopped letting them forget. The air in the house shifted that evening. It wasn't a gust of wind or the scent of something burning. It was the weight of discomfort, heavy and unfamiliar. I heard hushed voices from the hallway as I folded laundry in my room, the door slightly ajar. Her voice came in sharp fragments, brittle where confidence used to be. She wasn't laughing now. I imagined her trying to explain away the diploma, scrambling to twist it into a misunderstanding. But the silence that followed told me he wasn't agreeing, wasn't laughing, wasn't defending her. I knew my son well. I knew how long it took him to process betrayal, how guilt wore him down from within. Tonight I knew the realization had finally begun to settle that for years. He'd allowed the woman he loved to chip away at the one who raised him, and he'd said nothing. I heard glasses being put away with more force than necessary, a drawer slamming, footsteps pacing without direction. She was unraveling, her curated world starting to show cracks. And I hadn't caused it. I had simply removed the veil. I kept folding shirts and towels with slow, deliberate movements. Each crease was a thought, each fold a memory. I didn't need to hear the full argument to know its shape. It had been building for a long time, not just about me, but about control, respect, and the stories we tell ourselves to justify our actions. At some point, the door to their room closed with a solid, definitive thud, not slammed, but pressed shut with purpose. After that, the house settled into a strange stillness, not peace, but the tension of restraint, a silence waiting to break. The next morning, she didn't come into the kitchen. He did. His eyes were tired and rimmed red, and he moved carefully, uncertain of what to say or do. I poured coffee and set it on the table without a word. He nodded in thanks, a quiet, broken gesture. I noticed him glance at the box still sitting on the counter. I'd left it there on purpose, a mirror they couldn't avoid. He didn't ask about it. He didn't need to. That day, the atmosphere in the house changed. The music she used to play while cooking was off. Her scented candles remained unlit. The TV was silent for hours. The rhythm of the house had fractured. She moved like a ghost, avoiding eye contact, leaving the room when I entered, pretending to be busy with tasks that didn't exist. He started, staying later at work, or maybe just staying away. When he came home, there was no laughter, no clinking wine glasses, no whispered conversations, only the occasional heavy sigh, the kind you make when you realize something is lost and you don't know how to get it back. She tried to reclaim control once, leaving a stack of real estate brochures on the coffee table, as if to suggest they were finally looking for their own place. But I knew it was just a performance, a distraction, her way of regaining the narrative. I didn't touch the brochures. I didn't ask. I simply kept setting the table for 3, then 2, depending on who appeared. One evening, she brought me a plate of store-bought cookies, still in the packaging, mumbling something about a peace offering. I didn't respond, not out of cruelty, but because I didn't recognize the gesture. Not after all the time she'd walked past me like I was a lamp, or laughed with her friends about how little I must have known or achieved. Panic doesn't always look like screaming. Sometimes it's cookies in a plastic container. Sometimes it's someone rearranging the couch pillows 4 times in an hour. Sometimes it's silence that drips too slowly, or footsteps that pause at your door before moving on. But I didn't open the door. I let her sit with the tension she'd created. It wasn't about rent anymore. It wasn't even about the diploma. It was about the story she'd told herself that I was less than her, that I didn't belong in her world, that I should stay quiet, invisible, useful. Now that story was broken, and she was standing in its wreckage, barefoot, trying not to bleed. I didn't gloat. I didn't seek revenge. I simply resumed my place, not beneath her, not around her, but beside the truth. And the panic she felt wasn't mine to soothe. It was hers to answer for. In the days that followed, I began to move, differently through the house, not with anger or bitterness, but with a clarity I hadn't allowed myself in years. The air between us no longer crackled with tension. It simply grew still, like the quiet after a storm, when the damage is already done. We spoke only when necessary. No small talk, no fake smiles. We passed in the hallways like strangers who once knew each other in another life. I stopped cooking for them. At first, it felt strange. I'd prepared meals out of habit for so long that my hands would chop, stir, and season before I even thought about it. But now, I made only what I needed: a bowl of soup, a piece of toast, a single cup of tea. I no longer set 3 plates at the table or asked what time they'd be home. I ate alone, and I ate in peace. My routines became my own again. I took long walks in the morning, letting the cold remind me I was still alive. I visited the library, ran errands without telling anyone where I was going. I lingered in cafes, watching people, reading, scribbling thoughts on napkins. I reclaimed silence as a space to breathe, not something to endure. She tried once or twice to return to politeness. She asked if I needed anything from the store. I said no. She mentioned a new recipe she wanted to try. I nodded but didn't participate. I offered no warmth, no forgiveness. Not yet. Forgiveness, I'd learned, isn't something you owe just because time has passed. Sometimes the real wound isn't the insult itself, but the way it's dismissed afterward, and that's what hollowed me most. Not the words, but the years she spent pretending I was nothing but background noise. He grew quieter, coming home later, avoiding the living room unless he thought I wasn't there. Guilt clung to him like an old coat he didn't know how to take off. I didn't confront him. I had no energy left for lectures or tears. Let him sit in his own silence now. I started sorting through old boxes in my closet photo albums from when my son was little, journals from my early days practicing law, letters from colleagues, some long gone. In the evenings, I spread them across my bed like sacred artifacts, proof of a life no one else in this house had cared to know. I called my lawyer. It wasn't dramatic. I simply scheduled an appointment, dressed in my best wool coat, and went. The office smelled of leather and old files. I handed him a folder with a copy of the deed, my new will, and a letter. A letter making it clear I wanted the house to go elsewhere, not to them, not to anyone who thought proximity meant entitlement. When I returned home, I placed the lawyer's receipt on the kitchen counter. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. She saw it, her eyes flickering at the firm's name. She didn't ask. She wouldn't dare. I slept better after that. No more waiting for footsteps in the hallway. No more pretending to be asleep when voices rose in the living room. I no longer cared what they said or thought behind closed doors. I had done what I needed. The rest was not mine to carry. I spent more time outside in the garden, on the porch steps at the park. I sat with books, sipped coffee, watched the world move, let the sun rest on my face, and felt the seasons change, not just outside, but within. I didn't mourn the loss of closeness because what we had wasn't closeness. It was proximity, wearing a mask. Real closeness requires respect, and once that's gone, all that's left is something cold and hollow. I didn't hate her. I didn't even dislike her anymore. I simply released her. Released them both from the illusion that we were a family, held together by anything but obligation. I had spent years stitching myself into their lives with invisible thread, thinking if I stayed useful, kind, and quiet enough, I might be seen. But I was done sewing myself into a story that treated me like a footnote. Now I lived parallel to them, not with them. And in that distance, I found something I hadn't realized I was still searching for. Myself. The house was quiet the morning. She left. No suitcase wheels in the hallway. No slammed doors. No dramatic goodbyes. Just an absence. A hollowing out of sound. I stepped into the kitchen and instantly knew she was gone. Her perfume no longer lingered. Her mug wasn't in the sink, and the silence had shifted from tension to vacancy. I didn't ask questions. I didn't check the guest room or look out the window. I poured my tea, sat at the table, and sipped slowly. There was no note, no explanation, no apology. But there was a retreat, an unraveling, a quiet acknowledgement that her version of this story had ended. He stayed. He hovered in the background those first few days, unsure how to speak to me, unsure if he even had the right. Guilt clung to him every time he entered a room. He tried to fill the silence with tasks washing dishes, cleaning the garage, offering to drive me to the store. I said little, not out of anger, but because there was nothing left to explain. The truth had already spoken louder than words ever could. For a while we lived like that, two people orbiting the same space with caution and quiet. And then, one evening, he made dinner. He set the table, served the plates, and sat down across from me without saying a word. The food was a little overcooked, The seasoning uneven, but what mattered was his effort. It tasted different. We ate in silence, a comfortable one that didn't need to be filled. Later that night, he knocked on my door. I was sitting on the edge of my bed, sorting through old court transcripts and letters from former clients, yellowed with time but still sharp with memory. He didn't come in, just stood in the doorway holding a photo I hadn't seen in years, from the day I passed the bar exam. I was in front of the courthouse, arms raised, my smile wide and uncontained. He had been just a boy, clinging to my coat, too young to understand but proud all the same. I remembered how he'd shouted, "My mom's a lawyer," to anyone who'd listen. He handed me the photo without a word, then turned and walked away. I stared at it long after he was gone. The next day I made a decision, not out of bitterness, but out of completion. I visited my lawyer again and amended the letter attached to my will. The house would still go to the organization I had chosen, but I added a clause. My son could stay until he no longer needed to. Not as an heir, but as a guest, a tenant of memory, not entitlement. It was a final kindness, one that didn't erase the past, but honored the part of him that, however late, tried to see me clearly. I began packing soon after. Not everything, just the essentials. I'd found a small apartment near the lake, a quiet place with soft light and wide windows where I could read, walk, and breathe without explanation. The rent would be modest, the view generous, and the silence mine alone. I left behind most of the furniture, the plates, the decor, but I took the box, the diploma, the letters, the rent receipts, and the photo. My life in fragments, held together, not by history but by choice. On the morning I left, I walked through each room slowly, not to say goodbye, but to make peace with the space I'd filled for so long. I stood in the kitchen where I'd once been invisible, touched the edge of the dining table that had never truly been mine, opened the window in the guest room, and let the air move through one last time. I left no note, no announcement. I simply closed the door and walked away. Freedom didn't feel like fireworks or thunder. It felt like air, like the absence of waiting, like the return of something I'd once given up to survive. Now, in this new place, I drink my tea on the balcony, in the mornings, and write letters to no one. I read books I never finished, plant herbs I may forget to water, and listen to the wind with the patience of someone who has nothing to prove. Sometimes I think of them, not with anger, just a distant ache, like touching a bruise that's almost healed. They thought they knew me, but they never asked, and now they never will.